Today on Face the Nation, 50 years after the March on Washington, has Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream come true?
They marched on Washington today. For one day, while the Congress, the country, and the world watched, they took over the nation's capital in the name of civil rights. What was its impact on the real Washington? That is, the Washington that governs the United States of America. In the lead, Martin Luther King, the man hailed today above all the others.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream.
Today, we'll talk about King's dream and the state of race relations with some prominent African-American leaders, including former Secretary of State Colin Powell and legendary civil rights leader Georgia Congressman John Lewis, who was with King that day. Plus, we'll hear General Powell's advice to the president on the crisis in the Middle East.
In both Egypt and Syria, America has to take a much more clever role.
We'll also talk about the situation in Syria with Senator Jack Reed and Representative Mike McCall. It's all ahead on Face the Nation.
And now from CBS News in Washington, Face the Nation with Bob Schieffer.
Good morning again. Tens of thousands turned out in Washington yesterday to mark the 50th anniversary of the march. We'll begin today with someone who was not in Washington when Dr. King spoke and didn't know about the speech for weeks. Colin Powell was an Army officer in the jungles of Vietnam, but his wife and son were in Birmingham. It was the summer Bull Connor had sick police dogs on black protesters there, so as Powell fought the Viet Cong, his father-in-law was back in Alabama guarding his family.
My wife didn't share all the details with me. She didn't want to bother me, and mail took weeks to travel to Vietnam in those days. But I really got a sense of what happened when I got back from Vietnam later that year, shortly after Kennedy was killed. And I realized what was going on in the country. And as a soldier, I couldn't participate in this. I could just watch it. And as I watched it unfold, I said, you know, this is a time for America to live up to its creed. And this is the time for us to understand that segregation and Jim Crowism and these awful laws are not just a burden for African Americans, they are a burden for all Americans. America is carrying this horrible weight on its shoulder that we at one time hoped would be relieved by the Civil War. But the Civil War didn't do it, notwithstanding President Lincoln's desires before he was assassinated, when he talked about a rebirth of a nation of the people, for the people, by the people, but he meant all the people. But it didn't happen. And Jim Crow and segregation came in, so we needed a new effort, a new Civil War. And the leader of that war was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I was very interested to read in Time magazine, in their special issue devoted to this anniversary, you said the I Have a Dream speech held up a mirror for all Americans to look deeply into the spirit and soul of our country. If that same mirror were held up today, what do you think it would show?
I think it would show that enormous progress has been made. African Americans and other minorities have moved to the top of every institution in American society, whether it's politics in the form of a president, or in the military, or in finance, or in corporate America, in media America. And so a lot has been accomplished, and we should be so proud of our accomplishments. But at the same time, that mirror should show us that there are still problems in this country, that there is still racial bias that exists in certain parts of our country, that we cannot be happy until every youngster gets a quality education, regardless of where he lives or the color of his or her skin. We've got to be sure that we do everything we can to make equal opportunity in jobs and economics available to all Americans. So I would say, and if Dr. King was here, I'm quite sure he would say, congratulations on all the progress that's been made, but let's keep going. The dream is not fully achieved yet.
This year, the Supreme Court voided part of the Voting Rights Act that came in 1965. The part that instructed, it said that if the states that had a history of segregation had to get the approval of the federal government before they could make changes in their election processes, the court told the Congress to update that. But Congress in the state of gridlock it is now, obviously nothing is going to happen. What did you think of the Supreme Court's decision?
I would have preferred that they did not reach such a conclusion, but they did, and I can see why they would reach such a conclusion. The concern I have now is that many states are putting in place procedures and new legislation that in some ways makes it a little bit harder to vote. You need a photo ID. Well, you didn't need a photo ID for decades before. Is it really necessary now? And they claim that there's widespread abuse and voter fraud, but nothing documents, nothing substantiates that. There isn't widespread abuse. And so these kinds of procedures that are being put in place to slow the process down and make it likely that fewer Hispanics and African Americans might vote, I think are going to backfire, because these people are going to come out and do what they have to do in order to vote. And I encourage that.
Some Republicans have been behind these efforts to tighten up voter ID laws and all that sort of thing. Are they closed-minded about this?
Well, I don't know if I would characterize it that way. I think some of them honestly feel that it is appropriate to ask for more identification. But when they start to say, let's restrict the number of voting hours or make it harder for students to vote, then I have to get a little bit suspicious of it. But here's what I say to my Republican friends. The country is becoming more diverse. Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and African Americans are going to constitute a majority of the population in another generation. You say you want to reach out. You say you want to have a new message. You say you want to see if you can bring some of these voters to the Republican side. This is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to make it easier for them to vote and then give them something to vote for that they can believe in. It's not enough to say just we have to have a new message. We have to have a new substance to that new message.
What do you think the implications and the fallout of the Trayvon Martin case will be?
I think that it will be seen as a questionable judgment on the part of the judicial system down there. But I don't know if it'll have staying power. These cases come along and they blaze across the midnight sky, and then after a period of time they're forgotten.
After the Trayvon Martin verdict came in, the president spoke very passionately about his own experiences as an African American. He talked about walking across the street and hearing people click, lock their car doors, things of that nature. How did you feel about that? Were you glad to see him do that, and would you like to see him be more passionate about race questions?
Yeah, I like to see him be more passionate about race questions, and I think that was an accurate characterization of some of the things that we were exposed to. I mean, in my lifetime, over a long career in public life, you know, I've been refused access to restaurants where I couldn't eat, even though I just came back from Vietnam. We can't give you a hamburger. Come back some other time. And I did, right after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. I went right back to that same place and got my hamburger. And they were more than happy to serve me now. It removed a cross from their back. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And so we've got to keep working on it, and for the president to speak out on it is appropriate. I think all leaders, black and white, should speak out on this issue.
Should he do more? I mean, he is the first African-American president, but is there more to be added to his legacy here?
He's the president of the United States. So I used to refer to myself as the Secretary of State who happens to be black, not the black Secretary of State or the black chairman. There ain't a white one somewhere. And so he has a responsibility to the whole country. And I think he should speak out on these issues, not just because he's the first black president, but because he is the president of the United States. And this is a problem that affects all of America, not just black Americans. It's something that is still a residual effect of our history, of the racism that existed by law, of segregation, of slavery. And I think we're slowly, surely moving away from this. And it's going to change, it's going to require more change in the hearts and minds of people. But we're going to get there. I have no doubt about that.
More and more, as we watch this situation in Egypt unfold, it seems that we have somehow less and less influence on events. What advice do you have for the president right now on what we should be doing? What can we do to influence events there?
As I view this situation now, the military leadership, General Assisi and his colleagues, have essentially, to use a poker term, gone all in. I don't think anything that we can do right now is going to pull General Assisi from that position. He feels it is his place now to bring order to the society. I think what we have to be ready to do is, when things have quieted down, make sure that the Egyptians know, not only the generals, but the others know, that America is ready, willing, and able to help you with economic assistance, with any assistance you need in putting in place institutions, but with a requirement that you have to go from this military controlled society to a society that is based on representational voting for all Egyptians to decide what kind of a government they wish to be living under. Some of the tools that we love to talk about here, should we have economic aid or should we continue to provide military aid to Egypt? This is all sort of trivial. He can do without it, and if we don't give it to him, it won't affect his actions right now, and if we give it to him, it probably won't change his behavior. And so I think that's sort of a side issue, whether we provide aid or not aid. More fundamental issue is he is committed to bring what he considers stability to the country, put down the demonstrations. And we have to make sure that as he moves in this direction, we'll have to caution him about becoming too repressive and some of the violence that has been perpetrated against people who are just demonstrating. And so it is not a good situation, and I deplore, as everybody does, the number of lives that have been lost. But hopefully this will quiet down in the near future so that we can get back to a sensible path to a democratic Egypt.
And the situation in Syria?
Situation in Syria, I consider it just about now a civil war. And who's going to prevail remains to be seen. I have no affection for Mr. Assad. I've dealt with him, I know him, and he is a pathological liar with respect to my interaction with him. But at the same time, I am less sure of the resistance. What do they represent? And is it becoming even more radicalized with more Al-Qaeda coming in? And what would it look like if they prevailed and Assad went? I don't know. And so in both Egypt and Syria, America has to take a much more clever role. We shouldn't go around thinking that we can really make things happen. We can influence things, and we can be ready to help people when problems have been resolved or one side has prevailed over the other. That's when I think we can play a role. But to think that we can change things immediately just because we're America, that's not necessarily the case. These are internal struggles. And the parties inside those countries are going to have to sort it out amongst themselves.
Let me just ask you in closing, on this anniversary, what are your thoughts?
My thought is that this country's come so far. I mean, it's easy to say that, well, we still got a lot of problems, and we do. But we should not overlook how far we have come. Since 1963. I have seen things that I couldn't have imagined. I have seen the President of the United States. I was able to achieve high positions in our government. Increasingly, if you have education, if you have the background, if you have the right grooming in your family, and you apply yourself and you have ambition, you can rise to any height you want to in this country. That is a remarkable improvement from 1963. And so I think we should be very proud of what we've accomplished, but we should not say, all done, it's all okay, because it isn't. And I think if Dr. King was here, he would be jabbing us. You know, education, housing, jobs, economic opportunity, that's what he would be walking about, talking about, and marching about.
Colin Powell. We'll be back in a minute.
We must say, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient.
And that was a very young John Lewis, 23 years old, as a matter of fact, up there on the podium with Martin Luther King Jr. Congressman Lewis joins us now to talk about that day. You heard Martin Luther King on the radio. You had been inspired by him. In college, you organized sit-ins in Nashville. You became a freedom rider. You risked your life on the southern bus stations by simply sitting in the seats that had been reserved for whites. You had been beaten and arrested many times before you got to that day in August of 1963. Congressman, welcome to the broadcast. I want to start a little before that day, because you went with Martin Luther King Jr. in a delegation in June of that year to tell President Kennedy about the March on Washington, and he was not happy about it.
Well, I remember that day very, very well, meeting with President Kennedy. A. Philip Randolph, one of the leaders during that period, spoke up and said, "Mr. President, the masses are restless," in his baritone voice. "The masses are restless, and we're going to march on Washington." And you can tell by the body language of the president. He sort of started moving and twisting. And he said, "Mr. Randolph, if you bring all these people to Washington, won't there be violence and chaos and disorder? And we will never get a civil rights bill through the Congress." Mr. Randolph responded and said, "Mr. President, this will be an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent protest." We came out of that meeting and we spoke to members of the media. And we said we had a meaningful and productive meeting with the President of the United States. We told him we were going to march on Washington.
Now, you were pretty much a firebrand in those days. I'm told you actually toned down the speech that you had planned to make. Why was that?
Well, some people thought my speech was a little too strong, or some would say maybe a little too militant. I said in the beginning, in my prepared text, I thought the Kennedy proposed legislation was too little and that it was too late. And then another part of the speech, I said, "You tell us to wait. You tell us to be patient. We cannot wait. We cannot be patient. We want our freedom, and we want it now."
Did Dr. King, did he weigh in on that? Did he say, "John, maybe that's a little beyond
King,
where we should go"?
Yeah, Dr. King said as he read some of the text, said, "John, that doesn't sound like you." I couldn't say no to Martin Luther King Jr. He was my inspiration. He was my hero.
When you heard Martin Luther King speak, the whole part about "I have a dream" just came out. That part wasn't written down. But as you heard it, what did you think of it? Suzanne?
Well, when I heard those words,
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American
Well,
dream.
since he's on tape,
I knew he was not just speaking, he was preaching. He transformed the marble steps of the Lincoln Memorial into a modern-day pulpit. And he knew he was making contact. Dr. King grew up in a church in Atlanta. And when he started preaching, his father would say to him from time to time, "Make it plain, son, make it plain." So when he got to "I have a dream," he was making it plain.
It was after that, of course, in the same year that President Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became the president, and in 1965, you organized the March on Selma, Alabama, which also came to be a turning point in this movement. Others, you and others, were beaten. We all saw it on television. Tell me about that day.
Well, on Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 of us attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the state of Alabama and to the nation that people wanted to register to vote. All across the South, it was almost impossible for people to register to vote, simply because of the color of their skin. There was one county between Selma and Montgomery. The county was more than 80% African American. There was not a single registered voter in the county. So we had planned to walk all the way from Selma to Montgomery and take our concern to Governor Wallace. On that day, I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable.
Today on Face the Nation,
I thought I was going to be arrested and I was going to go to jail. So in this backpack, I had 2 books, 1 apple, 1 orange. I wanted to have something to eat. I had toothpaste and toothbrush. I thought I was going to be in jail. I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. We get to the highest point on the bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. And a man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. It will not be allowed to continue. You must return to your homes or go back to your church."
And you are ordered to disperse now and go back to your church.
And Jose William, who was walking beside me from Dr. King's organization, said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray before we can pass the word back for people to kneel and pray." The major said, "Troopers, advance." You saw these guys putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and trampling us with horses. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. Had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die.
Good morning again. I think anyone, including me, who saw those pictures would never forget them. And it was 8 days after that that Lyndon Johnson introduced the Good Voting morning
Rights
again. Tens of thousands
Well, Bob,
turned out
I
in
want to say to you that
Washington
President
yesterday
Johnson
to
never
mark
get the credit
the
that he
50th
should
anniversary
receive.
of the march.
The night he
We'll
gave
begin
that
today
speech,
with
Johnson never
someone
get
who
the
was
credit
not
he
in
should
Washington.
receive. The night he gave that speech, it was the most meaningful speech any American president had made in modern time on the whole question of voting rights, of civil rights. And when he concluded that speech, he said, "And we shall overcome." Dr. King cried. I was sitting next to him. I cried. He introduced that bill, and the Congress passed it. And 48 years later, the Supreme Court gutted. It put a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Well, you know, Justice Scalia said that provision amounted to this is his two words, racial entitlement.
I was shocked. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that a member of the United States Supreme Court was saying providing a way, making it possible for people to participate in a democratic process would be described as a racial entitlement.
Final question. What do you think Martin Luther King would say today if he could look at America, see where it was, where we have come?
50 years later, if Dr. King could speak to us, he would say, "We've come a distance. We made a lot of progress. You're in the process of laying down the burden of race, but we're not there yet." He'd be grateful to see an African American as president of the United States. It's almost unreal, unbelievable, Dr. King was there, that 150 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, 50 years since I made the speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and look what you have done. Dr. King would say, "My dream is in the process of becoming real."
John Lewis, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
Back in a moment with some personal thoughts. I was still a newspaper reporter in Fort Worth when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke that day. I watched it all on television with wonder and relief. Wonder at the power of his words, relief that it had all gone so peacefully. By then, I considered myself an enlightened person on race, but I had grown up in Jim Crow, Texas, where whites and blacks lived in worlds separate in ways large and small. I never shook hands with a black person until I was in the Air Force. Not that I didn't want to, I just never had the occasion. They lived on one side of town, I lived on the other. Schools were still mostly segregated, and the newspaper where I worked generally ignored news about black people. White people were not accustomed to seeing so many black people in one place as converged in Washington that day, so it made them nervous. They worried it could turn into a race riot, a concern we later learned, and you heard John Lewis say, was shared by President Kennedy. It did not turn into a race riot. Instead, it was a turning point in American history, a day that changed America, not just for African Americans, but for all of us. I know. I was there back in the olden days. Some of our stations are leaving us now. For most of you, we'll be right back with more on Dr. King's legacy with Marian Wright Edelman, Ben Jealous of the NAACP, and author Taylor Branch. And we'll have the latest on the situation in Syria. For more now on the U.S. options in this Syrian crisis, we want to talk to our State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan and David Rode, a foreign affairs columnist for Reuters. Margaret, you had some late news from the State Department, their reaction to Syria saying it'll allow the inspectors to come in there.
Well, the UN has confirmed that its team will be on site for this fact-finding mission as soon as tomorrow. The White House, however, thinks that's not good enough. This is 5 days after the alleged attack. There's been significant artillery fire, significant shelling that has degraded what evidence exists on the site. So in the administration's view, this is not necessarily a question of whether or not a chemical weapons attack happened. They believe there was one. It's just building that chain of evidence, and that's what the U.S. intelligence community is looking at right now.
So do you think this is increasing the possibility that we will take some sort of military action here?
The rhetoric certainly seems to be pointing in that direction, but what we do know is that there's a hard diplomatic push underway. The U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, is in Istanbul today. He's meeting with the president of the Syrian opposition, and what we know is that the White House, they want to see an exit before they enter here. There's a lot of pressure on the Syrian rebels to explain what happens in the next 12 hours. If we act, what are you actually going to do here? Because by their own admission, by many's analysis, they're not ready to run the country. We're not looking at intervention that would necessarily take out the Assad regime. We're looking at sort of an extraction here, something that would plug in, hopefully, into an existing infrastructure, maybe some kind of transitional government, and that's what people are talking about at this point.
David, realistically, what are our options here?
I think you're going to see potentially a Tomahawk missile strike, long-range airstrikes that won't endanger American servicemen. I think chemical weapons are different. The U.S. will use those strikes to try to destroy the Syrian Air Force, to punish Assad, send a message that chemical weapons are unacceptable. We'll work with the FSA. I think we have to keep arming them and push with the Russians, but there has to be a response from the U.S. government. Chemical weapons are different, and it's just getting worse in Syria.
Do you see any possibility that we could somehow convince the Russians that it's also in their interest to try to broker some sort of a ceasefire and then sort of take it from there?
Not until Assad's calculus on the ground changes militarily. So if you eliminate his air force, which weakens him, and you have a serious effort to arm the Syrian rebels, there are Syrian opposition members that hate the jihadis. They hate the al-Nusra Front, but we're not backing them, and we sort of have to make a move here. No U.S. ground troops, no U.S. invasion. Sort of what Secretary Powell said, you shape things. You try to put the moderate Syrians in a position to play a major role. If they fail, you step back, but you do try to do something.
And there's been such a debate within the administration about that moderate opposition, because the State Department and that team has really tried to help build them up, but they don't have a lot of backup on that front. They haven't been able to deliver the weapons that the White House said they were going to give, the weapons that have been coming through, these Chinese-made missiles being paid for by the Saudis are coming in through the north and the south. But the help from the United States of America hasn't been clear, and it hasn't been loud. And there's the bet, if you help them, they'll be our guys. If you don't, we don't know. Maybe those weapons will end up in the wrong hands.
The Saudis are giving weapons to the jihadis. The Qataris are giving weapons to the jihadis. We've stepped back. We tried to have our local allies deal with it. It hasn't worked. There has to be a bigger, new approach, and the White House has to take a risk.
We also had to be thinking about what is going to be the response from the Syrians if we do this, because you've got all kind of things. You've got Iran over there who's saying don't do it. What if they decide, I pose this question earlier, drop a few artillery shells into Tel Aviv?
That's the problem. I mean, Assad could carry out another chemical attack. You know, what do we do then? I just fall back on chemical weapons are different. This hasn't happened in 20 years. There has to be a price for gassing hundreds of civilians. There has to be.
Do you agree with David that you don't see any possibility we put U.S. troops in there, Margaret?
Well, the administration has said boots on the ground, not an option. These strikes, these other options that General Dempsey has outlined in that letter that was made public, including saying, hey, we should back these moderate opposition fighters, are probably the most likely. Interesting to see that from the United Nations, Jeff Feltman, formerly of the State Department, will be in Tehran. He'll be talking to them about backing off perhaps their client.
That's a question. Do you allow Iran into some kind of peace talks about Syria? They are the key player along with Russia. The U.S. doesn't want to do that. We may have to do that if we want to eventually create a ceasefire.
Thanks to both of you. For more on this, be sure to watch CBS This Morning tomorrow, and we'll be right back with more on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we're back now to talk some more about Dr. King's legacy and the 50th anniversary of the march. There that day, joining us now, Marian Wright Edelman, the founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund. She started her career as a lawyer for the NAACP in Mississippi. Also here, Taylor Branch, the historian who has, of course, written 4 books on Dr. King and the civil rights era. His latest, The King Years, recently out in paperback. And, of course, our friend Ben Jealous, the president of the NAACP. Well, I want to start with you, Marian. When you were there, did you realize at the time the effect that Dr. King's speech was going to have?
Yes. And I realized, as one among the hundreds of thousands that were present, that we're at a transforming moment of nonviolent witness that was unprecedented in our history. As you indicated, the people were expecting violence, but here you had a huge multiracial, multi-faith, multi-generational, and I was 24 at the time, witness.
What did you feel like? Were you excited?
I was exhilarated. I felt empowered. I felt connected. It's always good to know that you're not alone, and that there are all these people coming out to say we're committed to making America America. So it strengthened me as I was being trained to go down in Mississippi and practice law. It was a great day.
Taylor, you've written all these books about the civil rights. Were you there that day?
No, I was at summer football camp in high school in South Georgia, and it was over 100 degrees. I wish I had been there.
Yeah. But when did you come to find out about it and know about it? Were you interested in that kind of thing in those days?
I had been, my whole formative years, the civil rights movement was tenacious, changing my life's interest. The Bull Connor demonstrations, when they put dogs and fire hoses on children in May 2nd and May 3rd, were an awakening experience for me as a white Southerner in segregated South. So yes, I was aware of it, but not the march itself until later, because I was at football camp.
I was so interested this morning to hear Colin Powell talk about he was in Vietnam when it happened. Didn't know about it for a couple of weeks later, but after the Bull Connor things that had happened, his father-in-law was there in Birmingham basically guarding his wife and child while he was away. I just thought the irony of
the march didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of those demonstrations. That's what made it happen. That's what made President Kennedy introduce the Civil Rights Act in June. So it was part of a continuing recognition that this was not only the principal obstacle to freedom, but it was also the gateway to freedom in race, if we could deal with it.
So the obvious question to you, Ben, what now? As you look back on it, how far have we come? How far do we have to go?
You know, when I was a journalist in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 90s, my old publisher used to say, the only problem with the New South is that it continues to occupy the same space and time as the Old South. And the reality is that there's too much about these times that is, you can draw too straight of a parallel. We're fighting for voting rights now in a real urgent way that we really haven't had to since then. A lot of the folks who came there yesterday were moved because of the senseless killing of a young black man. In this case, it was Trayvon Martin. Back then, it was Medgar Evers. And so I think the beauty of this moment is that we have young people who are really being baptized in the struggle, who are focused on winning victories now. They are winning big wins, whether it was last year, just 5 miles from here in Maryland, where we saw the state abolish the death penalty, pass the DREAM Act, pass marriage equality just in 1 year, or whether it's New York City, where we just passed a real racial profiling ban with teeth, or it's these young people who are demanding that the minimum wage be raised to $15. Kids trying to survive on $7.25 who just can't, who feel like they have nothing left to lose. And so we are very much now in a real movement moment. Young people are at the forefront often, and we're winning big wins. I think we can be hopeful.
Let me ask you, were you going to say something, Marian? Go ahead.
Well, we've been celebrating the dream, and we can celebrate the progress, but the agenda, I think that Dr. King would be proposing today would be clear. Of course he would be fighting voter suppression. Of course he would be speaking out against mass incarceration and stand your ground laws, and we've got to stand our ground against any more enactment of those laws, and so that the Trayvon Martins of our world can walk without being racially profiled. But he would be calling for a close of the morally obscene wealth and income gap in this country that has left millions millions of people out of our economy. He would be calling for a poor people's campaign, as he was when he was killed in Memphis, when we've got 46 million rather than 35 million poor Americans and 16.2 million poor children rather than the 11 million when he died. He told us about the opportunity to use our wealth to close these gaps and to use our wealth to make sure that everybody had their basic necessities. We still have not heard him. He would be talking about jobs, 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 decent wages. He would be talking about education. Our schools are still too much segregated and still very much unequal, and 80% of our black kids cannot read at grade level. And he would be calling for prevention measures to make sure we had an early childhood system to get children ready for schools. This is a time to finish the bounce check that still has not reached. The American promise has not reached the millions and millions of those left outside, and we need to get this country to realize that its greatest economic, military, and national security problem does not come from any enemy without. It comes from our failure to invest in our children who are uneducated, majority of whom are going to be of color. Our babies already are, and that's going to be our undoing.
Taylor, let me ask you about this move to tighten voter registration and all of that that's going on. The Supreme Court throws out that part of the law that says states with a history of segregation no longer have to get approval of the federal government before they can change the voting process.
Well, I think that it shows that there's an awful lot of resistance to the whole notion that the dream is ahead of us in the United States. Where I go, the biggest complaint I get is, why do you keep raising all this racial stuff? We're over it. And it seems to me that the basis of America is to say that we should get over talking about race is like saying a democracy should get over having elections. I mean, it's the basis of how we deal with one another and how we form a more perfect union. We advance when we do it in ways that bless not only race, but I'm a white Southerner. Dr. King said that dealing with race in 1963 would help the South, and manifestly it did. It liberated the white South. You never heard of the Sun Belt South when it was segregated. It was poor. It was terrorized. It was all invested in this thing. Blessings flow when we deal with race forthrightly. It is a very, very dangerous thing to try to avoid it. To me, the central unaddressed question in America today is what degree partisan gridlock is driven by race. We don't talk about that. Everybody says partisan gridlock is poisoning America, but nobody asks how much of it underneath is driven by race and racial resentment. And in that sense, we've gone backwards since 1963 because we're not really recognizing how we got to all the blessings that people take for granted.
Ben, if you had one thing that you could say, there are many things you'd like to see change, but one thing you could see changed in the next year in this country, what would it be?
We have to restore the Voting Rights Act. The right to vote is the right upon which our ability to defend all of our other rights is leveraged. And the Supreme Court has done real harm in a shamefully activist way. And we need Congress to come together like they have in the past and make sure that we can protect the right to vote for all people in this country.
All right. Well, you know, it's wonderful to hear all three of you this morning, and thank you all for coming on this very special day and this very special broadcast. We'll be back in a minute. That is it for us today. We will leave you today with the final thoughts of Martin Luther King Jr. on that hot August day, 1963.
From every mountainside, let freedom ring, and when they happen, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last.